Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 33, Winter's Tale. Winter Schnee. 6 years ago. It had been an hour. An hour of attempted studying that had been constantly interrupted by the stupid laughter and guffawing of a small group sitting at a table near the gate of the school. From their clothes, Winter could tell that they most likely were not students of Beacon Academy, so for them to have snuck their way on campus was enough to annoy her, let alone their constant jeering paired with the foul-smelling smoke that was carried on the gentle wind that blew from their direction. She would have loved to have been studying in her favorite spot in the library, a small desk with a comfy chair positioned by a large window to let through plenty of light, but unfortunately the library was under renovations, and the only other place she could enjoy the sunlight and gentle breeze was the table she had chosen outside. Ugh, she groaned in disgust as one of the loud group, a tall boy with jet black hair, called out for a girl who was walking nearby to come and join them. Much like every girl that he had tried it with, his attempt failed as the girl gave him a scalding glare and continued on her way, as the rest of the group once again ridiculed him for his failure. Thankfully, the boy calmed down for a few minutes after that, and, brushing the annoying hairs that hung in front of her face behind her ear, Winter attempted to once again focus on her studies. As she studied, the noise from the group once again rose steadily until their conversation was impossible to block out, and finally losing her patience, she slammed her book shut and stood from her seat. Instantly, she was aware that the eyes from all her fellow students were on her, as they had clearly been expecting her to act much sooner, owing to the fact that she was the student council president and had publicly scolded others for such behavior before. So pushing her chair away and moving out from behind the table, she made her way over to the rambunctious teens. They noticed her before she was even halfway, and the look of joy that took over their faces only grew with every step she took towards them. Eventually, she came to a stop before them, and all four turned to give her their full attention. "What are you doing on Beacon grounds?" she asked harshly, straightening her back and raising up to her full height. "You hardly look like the type of people who would attend such a prestigious academy." "Damn," a boy with obviously dyed, gunmetal gray hair said with a smirk. "I think rich bitch just tried to insult us." While the words were clearly meant to cause a rise out of her, she had been called far worse and simply raised an eyebrow in response. "With a tongue that foul, it's hardly surprising that every girl here has turned down your advances." "She's got you there, Merc." The only girl of the group laughed, a girl who looked a little older than she appeared with glowing gold eyes and black hair that faded to gray at the tips, earning a sneer from the boy. "Not like they're missing much either." "Shut up," he spat as he laid back on the table and put his hands behind his head. "Besides, didn't hear you complaining at Junior's party last week." "Ahem." Winter coughed pointedly, drawing the attention back onto herself as she had no interest in listening to such a topic. "I would like you to leave before I go and get campus security. And I would like you to join us." The boy with jet black hair grinned and patted his lap suggestively. "If your mouth can put Merc in his place, I wouldn't mind seeing WH." Before he could finish whatever foul sentence was about to leave his mouth, the fourth member of their group, a boy with bright orange hair wearing a white coat with red linings and a thin gray scarf, smacked him sharply on the back of the head. "Ignore my testosterone-filled friend here," he said, as he smiled a smile that was effortless compared to his companions. "Junior is the muscle of the group, so we don't really expect anything intelligent to come from that mouth of his." "I can hardly see anything intelligent coming from any of your mouths," Winter retorted, and to her surprise received a genuine laugh from the orange-haired teen. "Touché," he chuckled and put a cigarette to his lips, taking a long drag and blowing out smoke as he pushed himself off the table to stand up. "Though finding intelligent people to associate with is hard work. Like you have ever worked a day in your life, Roman." The girl laughed, and despite her earlier statement, turned to lay against the chest of the boy they had called Merc. "Well, that, Cinder, depends on your definition of work." The orange-haired teen, that she now knew to be called Roman, retorted as effortlessly as he smiled. "I would say work is doing something that contributes to society." Winter interrupted and crossed her arms impatiently. "But at first glance, you hardly seem to offer much." "Careful, rich bitch," the guy laying back on the table said with a chuckle. "Last girl to talk to him like that had him following her on all fours around like a lovesick puppy." The girl called Cinder finished with a chuckle that matched the boy she was laying against. Not my fault I like girls who can keep up with me. He laughed with what even Winter, much to her chagrin, had to admit was a rather charming smile. And at least I was on all four for love, and not for money. Dick, the girl replied and threw a chip of wood at him, that he smoothly dodged with a graceful spin that left him slightly closer to where Winter was stood. Losing her patience with the group's antics, she straightened herself and made sure that her next words carried the dangerous undertone that she often used when people were not responding how she liked. I have grown tired of this, she said pointedly, and took a step away from Roman. If you do not leave now, I... Yes, yes, Roman interrupted her, put his hands in his pocket, and tilting his head to the side a little in what was clearly amusement. You will go and get security. However, it's a nice day, and we really have nowhere else to go, so how about we strike a deal instead? I doubt I will be willing to strike any deal you have to offer. Humor me, please. With it being the first sign of manners she had experienced from the group all day, Winter decided that such behavior should at least be encouraged and raised an eyebrow for the boy to continue. Now you want us to leave while we want to stay. Certainly a tricky situation to resolve. However, I think we can meet in the middle. He motioned to his friends with a simple shrug of his shoulder. We'll promise to keep ourselves to ourselves if you give me one thing. And that would be? Winter asked, preparing her arm to slap the man for the request she knew was likely to come. The name of such a beautiful woman like yourself. The man replied confidently, that smile back on his face. Taken aback for a second, as that was most certainly not the request she had been expecting, she found herself, for some reason, considering the offer. The boy had in fact been much more polite than his friends, and seemed to at least carry himself with a little more dignity, but the more she thought, the more she remembered that she had absolutely no reason to take the offer. So giving the boy grinning teen one last, she turned on her heel and slowly began to walk away. There is a fine for trespassing on beacon grounds, she called as she walked away. So I would recommend you be gone before I return with security. Hearing no movement behind her, likely because she was now too far away, she turned back to see if her words had an effect, and fortunately it had, as the group seemed to be gathering their things. Or at least everyone was except Roman, who was still giving her a wide smile. A smile that oddly stuck with her as she turned the corner out of their sight. Winter had been enjoying the day so far. While the library was still under renovation, the sun was still shining outside, and for the first time in days, a gentle wind blew across the campus. While she would certainly have rather been relaxing and enjoying the warmth of Vale's spring, she did unfortunately have plenty of coursework to still finish, and it was that coursework she had spent most of the day peacefully working on. Much to her displeasure, however, just as she was putting the finishing touches on a rather thorough explanation for her business coursework, she heard a familiar chuckle from behind her and let out a small groan. I've been looking for you. How unfortunate for me, Winter replied instinctively, and continued with her work as if the boy was not there. It had been just over a week since she had confronted Roman and his friends, and she was starting to regret not giving their names to the security guard. Ever since that day, Roman had begun to sporadically show up to interrupt her study sessions, and while he was never rude, in fact he was rather polite every time, his insistence on learning her name had become a little annoying. So I've been asking around about you, since you refused to give me your name and all, he said, and sat down next to her, though she still refused to look at him. I wish you wouldn't, she replied bluntly, and continued her work. People might get the wrong idea and actually start to think we're friends. You wound me, Winter, he replied, the victory in his voice as he said her name enough to make her give in and turn to look at him. Instantly she regretted it as she was met with the same charming smile he had given her when they first met, and every time they had seen each other since, the same smile that had once interrupted her dream and left her question herself why she would dream of such a thing. Nonetheless, she kept the scowl on her face as she addressed him. Who told you my name? She demanded, wanting to know who she would have to kill later that day. Didn't get her name. He grinned and sat backwards on the seat so that he could face her better while basking in the sun that set his orange hair ablaze. Simply asked for the name of someone on campus who was incredibly stuck up in a way that made her all the more beautiful. I am not stuck up, Winter countered as she squinted her eyes at the teen. Really? He scoffed and picked up one of her books to look at it, Winter quickly snatching it back. You sure act like it. Kinda kills the fun, you know? You sure act like you know anything about me. Winter fired back and put the book back on the table. It is not stuck up for me to uphold the rules set by the college. Just because I do not allow your idiocy does not mean I cannot have fun. Then how about you show me how fun you can be? He chuckled, and Winter instantly chastised herself as she realized that he had played into his hands. Say over dinner and a movie? It was her turn to scoff, and she turned back away from the boy. In your dreams. You won't find me denying that. Only adding to her annoyance, the tone and honesty of his voice almost pulled a smile from her. While she did always find his advances annoying, there was also a part of her that rather enjoyed them, though she would never admit that secret to anyone. It had been some time since anyone had even glanced in her direction, and not because she was unattractive, because she knew for a fact she was, but because of her name. Admittedly, her attitude was usually described as quite standoffish, so also often made them think there was no point in even trying. In recent years, however, she was beginning to tire of that perception, and that was part of the reason she had never expressly told Roman to leave her alone. Well, maybe you should find a new girl to dream about, she replied and began to pack up her books. Because you and I will never happen, for more reasons than you can imagine. Not with that attitude. Her grinned, standing up and walking alongside her as she made her way back to the main building. However, as they came close to the door, he quickly stepped in front of her. Come on, give me one good reason. Just one, Winter asked, stopping just before him and slinging her bag over shoulder as he gave her a nod. I don't like you. Unfortunately, though she tried to believe she had spoken the truth, the words felt like a lie. So not looking at him, she moved to the side and walked into the building. But much like she had when they had first met, she found herself looking back to the boy out of interest, and was a little saddened to see him walking away. 2 weeks had passed since she had watched Roman walk away, and in those 2 weeks, Winter had found herself a little gloomier than she usually was. He had not visited since, and in the boy's absence, she had noticed something she never had before. No one talked to her. She had realized it wasn't just that boys weren't interested in her, it was that no one was. It had never really bothered her before, as she had never really had anything to compare it to. She had always been alone after all, but having had someone who actively sought her out, someone who seemed genuinely eager to see her, it had been a new experience that she quite missed. Caught up in her thoughts, she started slightly as the bell sounded throughout the room and her professor called for an end to the class. Standing up, she slowly made her way out of the class. She made her way to her usual spot in the courtyard. Thankfully, the renovations to the library were almost done, so she would be able to return there soon. As she walked, for reasons unknown to her, she found herself hoping that she would at least see a hint of orange hair. It was stupid and she knew it. After all, she hadn't given him a reason to visit again, but she had been finding herself looking behind her at the slightest of sounds ever since she had noticed his absence, and every time she had been disappointed to see nothing but fellow classmates. Maybe that's the problem, she thought to herself as she pushed her way out of the door and looked up to see her usual spot taken by a group of girls, and let out a sigh upon noticing every other table was also occupied. Maybe I should just ask to sit at one of them. But she knew that would never work. One of her biggest annoyances was chatter while she was studying, ignoring the fact that Roman had done it constantly. So to sit at the same table as a group of friends chattering to each other would only set her nerves on fire and put her in a bad mood. So letting out a frustrated breath, she turned away from the courtyard and made her way towards the dining area located near Beacon's waterfall. Reaching the large enclosed area and seeing it was deserted due to lunch being over hours ago, Winter quickly entered and placed her books on one of the small tables and sat down in the chair. The area wasn't as beautiful as the courtyard, but it had its charms. The wide, open archways let plenty of light inside, as well as the fresh smell of the shrubbery that surround the building. In the center of the room was a small fountain that gently trickled water and gave off a more calming atmosphere. Deciding it was satisfactory, she opened her book and started to study. It was actually rather peaceful for the first hour, but she was halfway through the second hour when she heard a voice behind her that caused her stomach to flip, a result that left her slightly confused. If you're trying to make it harder to find you, then I'm just gonna search longer. Turning to face the voice, she found Roman leaning against one of the pillars surrounding the room, the same charming grin on his face as he inspected the fountain in the room. Or were you just trying to lure me to a more private place? You wish, Winter replied, trying her best to not show that she actually happy that he was there, though fearing the smile she felt attempting to pull at her lips might give her away. "You know me so well." He chuckled and pushed himself off the wall to make his way over, his confident walk clearly a show. "But I guess I got someone listening to my wishes because here we are." "Clearly not listening to mine then." Winter lied instinctively, though even she could hear that it was half-hearted at best. "And here I was hoping you missed me." He laughed and sat down in the seat opposite her and pointed to the fountain. "Do you know how fountains I've seen today? 6 all running." Confused as to what he was getting at, she raised an eyebrow and received a shrug in return. "Your point?" "Just pointing out how long I searched for you." He smiled and leaned back in the chair. She hummed and scowled at him, knowing he was lying by the dismissive tone in which it was said. Not knowing what to say, as she was never really one for unnecessary conversation, Winter returned her eyes to her coursework, more in an attempt to take her eyes off the boy's smile. After a few minutes of silence, however, she felt it necessary to ask the big question she had. "So where have you been?" "Well, look at that," he replied jovially, and placed his foot on the table to push himself back on the chair's back legs. "Maybe you did miss me after all. Or maybe I want to know what I did so I can do it again." Again, the insult was half-hearted, and she received a laugh in return. "Sorry, Snow Queen." He laughed and rocked the chair gently in place. "Wasn't anything to do with you. My niece was ill, and I had to take care of her while my father worked." "Oh," Winter replied quietly, looking up as the tenderness to Roman's voice took her by surprise. "I'm sorry." "She's fine now." He shrugged, though even she could hear the slight relief in his voice. "What's her name?" "Neil," he replied with a smile. "But you're awfully talkative today." Winter knew an attempt to divert a conversation when she heard it. After all, she had used it plenty of times on her father. Knowing he likely wanted to change topic for a reason, she happily obliged. "Maybe because you are not trying to get into my pants and are actually talking properly for once." "I have never once tried to get into your pants," he said quickly, and let his chair fall back onto the floor with a little creak. "I mean, if you offer then, it would be foolish to refuse, but my offers to take you on a date are genuine." "Why?" Winter asked, not even bothering to feign interest in her coursework now. "You don't even know me." "True." Roman smiled as he gave a nod. "But that's the point of a date, right? To get to know each other. But as for why I want one, you're not afraid to insult me, and I find it fun. As Cinder said, I like a woman who can keep up with me." Staring at the boy for a moment, she saw that he was serious and, for a split second, had the crazy thought of agreeing. "Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Roman." She sighed and looked down at her work. "But agreeing to go on a date you would be a very bad idea." "Why?" Surprised that the question had been turned on her, Winter returned her gaze to him and saw that the smile was gone from his face, replaced by actual disappointment instead. Not wanting to lie, she gave another sigh and sat back in her chair. "Because it would not go anywhere," Winter explained slowly. "My father would never allow it." "I see," he hummed and stood up with a groan. "However, I have nothing to do tomorrow, so it's likely you will see me again. Might pop by the waterfall for lunch, not a date or anything, but if you want to join me then feel free. Do not hold your breath," Winter said as he leapt over the low wall of an archway and gave a small wave with one of his charming smiles. As she watched him walk away and turn a corner, she let out a groan and let her head fall into her book. "Why am I even considering it?" she thought to herself. "This is a bad idea," Winter said to herself as she stood behind a pillar, the sandwich she had bought from the cafeteria gripped in her hand. Taking a small peek around the large hunk of stone that hid her from view, she saw someone sitting on the small bench near the low wall that blocked off the waterfall, the head of bright orange hair making it obvious exactly who it was. The entirety of the night before, Winter tried her best to focus on her work and had even skipped dinner to do so, though that was partially because her father was in a worse temper than usual. But every time she had tried to focus, her thoughts had instead turned to Roman. It wasn't the first time it had happened, as it was quite frequent during the 2 weeks in which she found herself missing the company he offered, and though the boy tended to be rather polite, it was the first time the thoughts had not been primarily annoyance. Instead, her thoughts had been egging her on to take him up on his offer. Why? She had no idea. As charming as the boy seemed to be, she had no idea how he had managed to worm his way into her head so much, and also knew there would be nothing that could develop from their interactions. But that didn't stop her from thinking about it. Ugh, this is so stupid, she sighed to herself as she took a foolish step out from behind the pillar and slowly made her way over to the boy. The closer she got, the more she told herself to turn back, to stop what she was doing, but before she had the chance, the head of orange hair turned to face her with a knowing smile. Is that pillar painted to your standards? He chuckled lightly, the gentle wind causing his long fringe to flutter. It will be when someone removes the graffiti from it. Winter lied quickly, feeling a small amount of heat rise to her cheeks at the knowledge that Roman had seen her hesitancy. Taggers at Beacon? He grinned and pulled a couple of fries from a container at his side. Weird, thought all of you were too posh for such a thing. Want some chips? Chips? Oh right, you're from Atlas, he said, with an amused shake of his head. I think you call them frites? Fritten, Winter corrected him as she sat down on the bench and held up her sandwich. And no thank you, I would rather not upset my stomach with how much grease those things have. You're lost. He shrugged and ate a few more. They might have gone cold though if you had taken any longer. You are lucky I joined you at all, Winter said with a raised eyebrow as she unwrapped her own food. Maybe. He smiled and turned around to rest his back against the armrest. Though I'm starting to think you actually like hanging out with me. And once again, you reinforce my belief that nothing intelligent will ever come out of your mouth, Winter replied before taking a bite of her sandwich, and just like the first time she had insulted him in such a way, he only laughed in response. Well, maybe I'll prove you wrong at some point during this date. This is not a date, Winter countered stubbornly, despite being very aware that it did fulfill most of the requirements to be considered one. If you insist. The words were said with a form of arrogance that portrayed exactly how little he believed her, and she could hardly blame him, as she barely believed herself. Thankfully, he decided not to push the point, and instead continued to eat his fries. So how were your classes? He asked and placed a few more fries into his mouth. Worth the money? You want to know about my classes? She asked, a little surprised by the tame question. Not really, he shrugged with a smile. I want to know about you, but that might be too close to date talk. My classes were fine. She scowled at the boy out of the corner of her eye and took another bite of her sandwich. Should I even bother to ask how yours were? I don't think my answer will make you think any better of me, he laughed with a small shrug. I decided to find my place outside of academics. Then I think you will find the amount of places will be much more limited, she replied, trying her best to not sound judgmental. True, but there are more important places for me to be right now than college. Like where? Now look who's asking personal questions. He grinned victoriously, like she had somehow proved a point, to which she simply rolled her eyes at him. But to answer your question, home. With your niece? Winter asked, remembering that she had been the reason he had not shown up for a while was because he had to look after the girl while his father worked. Where are her parents? For the first time since she had met the boy, his reply was not immediate, and she saw his face visibly drop. However, before she even think of what may have caused such a reaction to her question, his mask came back on, and he gave a shrug. Not around anymore, he replied, and even though his smile was back on his face, his voice held a darker undertone that told her to not press further. What about your family? Your dad seems like a jackass from what I hear on the news. Dies are a bardage, hinterlistage bastard, Winter spat coldly, earning a surprised, albeit confused look from the boy. The media knows nothing of his true nature. Wow, Roman said as he let out a breath of relief. I was half expecting you to smack me for bad-mouthing your family. You will find no love for my father from me, Winter said after calming herself a little, the mention or presence of the man she called father always causing anger to flood her veins like molten fury. Not after everything he has done. Sorry, he sighed, though Winter noted a hint of genuineness in his tone. Things not good at home, I take it? Things have never been good at home. Winter sighed and leant back on the bench, putting her sandwich aside due to her sudden loss of appetite. Father has seen to that. Fathers are just assholes, I guess, he said sympathetically, putting some more fries in his mouth. What about your mom? Winter shook her head at that question, not wanting to think about everything that was happening with her mother, and fortunately the boys seemed to understand. Another sore subject, I guess. Clearly not used to striking out so much, the boy sighed. I'm guessing your brother and sister are a sore subject as well then? With the boy having touched on a subject that she was perfectly willing to talk about, Winter let the thoughts of her mother drift from her mind and turned back to the boy. They're fine. Finally, he chuckled, stretching his arms exaggeratedly. So what are they like? Well, Whitley is 8, but already quite smart, she said proudly, and gave Roman a smile. And Weiss is almost 12 yet can already play the piano rather well. It's pretty much all she does lately, to be honest. Sound like they'll be a fearsome duo one day. Hopefully, Winter agreed and wrapped up her sandwich as the boy placed the last of his fries in his mouth and crushed the container in his hands. So, he grinned and put the cardboard box in his pocket. Can I ask about you now? Or is that still a little too date-like? Feeling a smile pull at her lips at the knowledge that he had been waiting patiently, Winter raised her arm to pointedly check her watch and let out an exaggerated sigh. There was only 10 minutes of her lunch break left, as she had wasted 15 minutes hiding behind the pillar. I suppose I have time for a question or two. Then I better make them good. He laughed and sat up a little straighter. Watching the boy think, Winter took a moment to inspect him properly. To her annoyance, she had to admit to herself that he was quite attractive. The bright green eyes, the vibrant orange hair with a fringe that hung low over his left eye, the long eyebrows, each aspect alone worked to the boy's favor, but his pale skin made them all stand out even more. Every dash of color on him drew the eye and made Winter have to force hers away so as to not appear too engrossed in him. All right then, he finally said with a mischievous grin. So what classes do you take? Staring at the boy incredulously, Winter couldn't stop the small chuckle that pushed its way from her lips as she shook her head in disbelief. What's so funny? He continued to grin. I'm genuinely curious now. Business and law, Winter replied, standing up as she knew she would have to leave soon to be on time for her next class, as well as the usual classes. And here I was hoping it would be a little more exciting. He laughed and stood up to join her. Though hearing you laugh made the question worth it. Caught off guard by the compliment, Winter blinked rapidly at the boy and gave him the first genuine smile since meeting him. Well, thank you, she said, a small amount of heat rising to her cheeks as she took a step backwards towards the building. But I must be going, or I will be late. Hold up, he replied and put his hands in his pocket. I recall you saying that you have time for 2 questions. Fine. Winter rolled her eyes, and while she didn't stop moving, she did slow pace. But be quick. All right, he said a little louder due to the distance. Will I see you here tomorrow? Stopping at the question, Winter knew this time that she would return. However, not wanting to give that away, she gave the boy a mischievous smile of her own and mimicked the boy's regular habit of shrugging his shoulders. I guess you will have to wait and see. Seeing a flash of eagerness behind his eyes, Winter turned around to hide the smile that was on her face and began to walk back to the building. She still knew that it was a bad idea, that it would only end horribly, but for the first time in her life, she had someone to spend time with, and she actually quite liked it. Having spent the vast majority of her day sorting through the immense amount of summer coursework she had been giving and doing her internship at the STC, Winter was feeling exceptionally tired. So as she walked through the small, silent breezeway that led to Beacon's dormitories, Winter took a deep breath of warm, floral summer air in the hope that it might invigorate her. Unfortunately, it did nothing. Instead, the shifting caused her arm, that supporting holding a heavy folder, to move slightly and make her even more aware of how heavy the thing was. So as she approached one of the many benches in the deserted path, she placed it down and stretched out her sore arm. As she rested, Winter took a look around at the area she rarely visited and had to admit it was actually quite beautiful. On either side of the pavement was a lush green lawn, with small rose bushes lining the point where the stone and dirt met, the red roses that rested in them standing out marvelously among the sea of green. Dotted throughout the lawn were large trees topped with bright green leaves that Winter knew had been transferred at great cost from the forest behind Beacon Academy, and underneath many of them were tables, so that students could study in the shade. Knowing that she could spare another 5 minutes, she leaned against the back of the bench to take a breather. It was after a few moments of letting herself relax that she felt the bench creak a little more from a weight that wasn't her own, and before she could jump up and away from whoever had snuck up on her, she felt a pair of warm hands rest over her own and a voice speak close to her ear. Hello there, Snow Queen. Recognizing the voice immediately, she felt herself relax a little and stopped trying to move away, though she did turn to throw an annoyed look in his direction. Could you not try to give me a heart attack? But if I don't, what other excuse will you use for why your heart beats so fast when you see me? Roman chuckled lightly and let her hands go to walk around the bench and lean against it next to her. So what are you doing around here? You tell me? She replied with a raised eyebrow. After all, you seem to be the one following me. Well, I was waiting in our usual spot, but you were a no-show. What? Checking her watch, she did indeed see that it was past the time in which she usually met him. I'm sorry, it has been such a long day that I completely forgot. Ever since the first time they had shared lunch at the waterfall almost a month ago, they had begun to meet rather frequently. Every time they met, she found herself enjoying her time spent with the boy more and more, and while his tendency to annoy her was still intact, she had rather enjoyed that she had someone who challenged her, though in a fun way. However, things had certainly gone a little further than she had ever intended to let it. She remembered the first time they had kissed, how Roman had been the first to lean in, and while she was hesitant and knew she should have stopped him, she hadn't. She remembered expecting it to taste horrible due to his smoking, even though she had noted that he only smoked occasionally, but was pleasantly surprised when there was no hint of his worst habit. In fact, he tasted like the oranges he had just eaten. She had even let herself enjoy it for a moment before pulling away, and while she had certainly tried her best to not make a habit of it, that had not been the only time such things had happened. Don't sweat it, he shrugged with a smile, his voice pulling Winter from her thoughts. So what's been so tiring about it? Well, apart from college, Father has made me start an internship at the company. Winter sighed in frustration. He still refuses to accept that I want to go into law instead. So why don't you just tell him to get lost and leave? Roman asked and leaned back to pick up the file she had been carrying. I mean, you said you don't want the company. Thank you, Winter said, as the boy tucked the file under one of his arms, and she pushed herself off the bench to continue walking to the dormitories. And I can't. If I leave, then my father's attention will turn to Weiss, and even Whitley. I do not want to do that to them. Letting out a short sigh at her predicament, she let her head drop to look at her feet. Besides, it's not like he will let me go that easily. If I leave home, he will just make my life difficult from afar until I come back, and there is not really anywhere I can go that his reach will not find me. I guess that's probably the shittiest thing about your dad being one of the richest men in the world, he hummed after a minute of silence, during which her head matched her slower pace. Giving the boy a short nod as they rounded the corner and the dormitory came into view, Winter held her hand out for the files Roman was carrying. However, instead of passing them to her, she felt fingers entwine with hers. Confused by the action, as she was still unsure of what they were exactly, her hand automatically began to pull away, only for her to stop it. She hated that she always reacting the same way, that it always took 2 attempts for her to be able to let her guard down. Ever since she had turned 16, her father had taken to organizing dates for her, and while she had tried her best to talk him down, he had been rather insistent. A couple were okay, some were pretty good even though there was never a spark, but there had been a few where the boy she had been on a date with had taken things a little too far, been a little more handsy that she was willing to put up with, and ever since, she had found herself preferring not to be touched. But she knew Roman wasn't like that. Sure, he could be quite forward and very flirty, but he always understood her boundaries. Furthermore, as much as she hated to admit it, she actually did like him. So letting out a small sigh of annoyance as she chastised herself, she let the hand slowly close back around his. So are you just going to stay at the company forever? Not if I can help it, Winter replied, feeling herself relax a little since she had pushed herself past the hesitation. And what would you do if you did leave? He asked with a mischievous grin and a slight glint in his eye. As great as you would look in a short skirt, I can't imagine you waiting tables to pay for Beacon. I would never be in a skirt, Winter replied, throwing the boy a smirk as she loosened her finger threateningly from his. And my father does not pay for Beacon as I refuse to take the business course. I pay my tuition with the money my grandfather left me. Well, that's one good way to give him the middle finger. Roman laughed amusedly and reclaimed his grip on her hand, pulling her a little closer as he lifted his arm up to rest it over her shoulders. Though not seeing you in a skirt is a real downer. Rolling her eyes at him, Winter felt a smile pull at her lips as she looked away. I am sure you will live. Maybe, but some illnesses have some really weird cures. Is there a cure for stupidity? Smart and beautiful women generally cure my stupidity. Letting out a small laugh as his carefree idiocy, Winter let herself be pulled and a little closer so that they were close enough to smell the deodorant the boy wore. It was a smell she actually quite liked, never too harsh like most men used, but gentle with a slight vanilla hint to it. Then clearly you do not know your medicine as well as you think you do, because I am both, yet you are still an idiot. Well, you see, Snow Queen, I'm also a fool for a girl that I need to impress. He grinned wickedly and stopped walking, spinning her around so that she came to a stop in his arms. So a double dose might be needed. Knowing what he meant by those words, Winter bit her lip and took a quick look around the area, as even though she really cared to hide anything, it would be unfortunate for people to start whispering before she even knew what they were. Seeing that they were still alone, she cocked an eyebrow at the boy and received a soft chuckle in return. Before she could persuade herself not to, she pressed her lips softly against his. As usual, tension ran through her at the touch, though none of it had to do with Roman, and having learned that was normal, the boy didn't return the pressure, instead waiting for her to relax a little. After a couple of seconds, she finally pushed the annoying reservation down and her body relaxed a little. Clearly sensing it, Roman's hand left her own and landed on her waist, pulling her into his body a little deeper as he finally returned the pressure. He had clearly smoked just before meeting her, and she could taste it on him, but it wasn't terrible as most of it was cut out by the strong taste of orange chocolate, and while she wasn't the biggest fan of sweet things, she was more than happy to let the pleasant taste fill her senses for a few seconds. As she did, she felt Roman's hand snake its way around to her back, where he had a better grip and allowed her body to collide with his for a moment, the boy's excitement obvious. However, feeling that, and knowing they could be interrupted at any moment, she cut the kiss short and pulled back to give him a cheeky grin. Too bad you can only have a double dose once a day, she said, and reached around to her back to take his hand. Well, dear lady, he replied in a faux posh voice, I think you will find that one dose is more than enough to cure idiocy for 12 hours. Laughing as, despite his word, the usual charming, stupid grin spread across his face, they began to walk again toward her destination. While she walked, she let herself fall in a little closer to the boy to enjoy the small moment of joy that he gave her, knowing that she would likely not feel it for the rest of the day due to meeting her father at the office once she was done delivering the files. Dizer bastard, Winter swore inwardly as she stepped out of the car and pushed the door shut with a little more force than was necessary. Dizer arrogant, egoistish bastard. Not bothering to thank the driver, as she was more often than not rather rude herself, Winter simply stalked away from the car as it drove off, throwing out more curse words under her breath. What on earth made him think she would ever go through with that? With him of all people. Feeling anger pulse through her veins as she stormed her way into Beacon, she completely missed the boy that was stood next gate, and as she felt a hand catch hers, her anger at the current situation caused a large wave of revulsion to rip through her. Tearing her hand free from whoever had grabbed it, she span around ready to shout them down for daring to do such a thing. What do you th? She began, stopping short as her eyes caught the green of Roman's. Staring into the concerned eyes for a moment, it suddenly registered just how heavy her breathing was. Hey, he said quickly, as armed help up as if to surrender, as a smile dropped from his face. What's wrong? Nothing. She snapped harshly at him, the logical part of her mind speaking up to tell her that he didn't deserve such a thing, and immediately making her regret doing so. See, while I normally find you playfully snapping at me attractive, I'm not as big a fan when you are serious and I have done nothing to earn it. He fired back quickly, his tone taking on the darker undertones she had only ever heard when he talked of his niece's parents weeks ago. Staring at the boy and noticing that the mischievous glint she liked so much was missing from his eyes, Winter swallowed the lump in her throat and took a deep breath. Roman was right, he hadn't done anything to deserve that. Once again, she had allowed her emotions to get the better of her and had accidentally lashed out. Sorry, she mumbled once she had finally gained enough control of herself. I just had a bad morning. Clearly, he remarked, the annoyance dropping from his face and making it impassive. Want to talk about it? I have class, she replied, making sure to keep her voice calm. You could skip? I can't skip, Roman. Winter sighed and turned around to make her way through the gate, only for Roman to step in front of her. Why not? He said, as if the question was a satisfactory retort. though as she raised an eyebrow at him, he rolled his eyes at her. I mean, you pay for those classes so you can choose not to go, and you're clearly pissed off, so do you really think you will get much done today? Staring at the boy but not moving, Winter thought over his words. He was right in a way. She rarely ever got work done when she was angry, as she was too often more focused on what had annoyed her than her class. And she certainly did pay for those classes, so what she did was up to her. But she had never skipped before. She had barely even taken a sick day. So while she knew her day would be unproductive, she shook her head at the boy. I still need to attend, she sighed, and made to walk around him. However, before she did, she noticed the mischievous glint was back in his eye. That's a shame, he shrugged as he stepped aside to let her pass. Because I'm pretty sure it would piss your father off. At that sentence, her body stopped halfway through its step towards the gate, and she turned to look at him properly. From the smug smile on his face, it was clear his words had the desired effect, and Winter couldn't help but scowl at him. Were her father issues really that obvious? Come on, he said coaxingly, his hands working their way into his pockets. It's a win-win situation. You're likely way ahead in your classes anyway. Just like many times since meeting Roman, she once again asked herself why she was even considering entertaining the idea. It was reckless, stupid, and would absolutely bring her nothing but trouble in the future. But at that moment, after what her father had arranged without even considering her input, she found herself taking a step away from the gate. Looking at him cautiously, she crossed her arms and squinted at him. So what are we going to do? I'm sure we can find something. He grinned and turned away from the gate himself, walking slowly towards the drop-off car park in a way that was clearly meant to persuade her to follow him. A little hesitant at first, she watched as he slowly walked away and truly considered if she wanted to do it. Her father would most certainly find out, and there would be hell to pay when he did, but wasn't that what she wanted? To let him know that he can't control her like he did everything else. To show in any way she could that she hated him? Knowing it was, she took one last look at her college, wondering which of her teachers he had in his pocket, before turning to follow Roman. In the time it took her to catch up, Roman had already come to a stop next to a car that could not be more different to the one that had dropped her off moments ago. Where hers had been a brand new model of a car not yet released to the public, the pure white untainted metal by a single speck of dirt, Roman's was likely older than both of them, with its blue paint chipped and half ripped away to show rusted metal beneath. Not exactly the same as the one you pulled up in, but she still runs, he shrugged, his words mirroring her thoughts. Mostly. Raising an eyebrow as he pulled the door open for her, she cautiously approached and took a look inside. Just like the outside, everything was tarnished. The seats had large rips in them, some covered by duct tape but others just left to leak the cushioning foam, and empty food containers and papers littered both the dashboard and the back seat, causing the slight smell of old food that clung to the air to invade her nostrils. You know there is such a thing as a brush that helps you clean things, right? Winter said, as she looked back to Roman to see him shaking his head. I have probably held more brushes than you have, Snow Queen, he replied humorously as she slowly climbed inside, making sure that there was nothing on the seat before sitting down. Shutting the door after her, she watched Roman quickly jog around the front of the car and slip himself into the front seat. If she were uneasy about being in a car that she was sure would give her tetanus should she even brush her finger against it before, the fact that the car took 3 tries to start did nothing to make her feel any better. Finally, however, the engine revved to life, and with a sidelong glance at her, he pulled out of the car park. For the first 10 minutes, nothing was said. Having rolled down the windows so that some of the old fast food smell, she had been more focused on the passing building and trying to enjoy the cool summer wind of her face. However, as they entered the rundown area of West Vale, they came to a stop at a traffic light, and she heard Roman's voice to her side. So what did your dick of a dad do this time? He asked, his voice a little more careful than usual. Same thing he always does, Winter replied plainly, the gentle rhythm of Roman's fingers drumming against the steering wheel helping to calm her slightly. Decided that what he wants matters more than what I feel comfortable doing. And I'm guessing you can't just tell him no. It's not like I didn't try that, she replied and leaned back a little in her seat as the light turned orange. But he refuses to listen. Roman hummed, the sound barely audible over the vibrating engine. So what is it he wants you to do? Letting out a sigh as she remembered the conversation that morning, she turned to look at him. To his credit, even though they were stopped, His eyes were watching the road, and that sight made her ease up a little. "He's throwing a summer ball at the mansion next weekend," she replied, her grip tightening on the door's handhold as she spoke. "And he wants me to accompany the son of a business associate he is hoping to secure a merger with. And I'm guessing from how annoyed you are that this guy's a dick too. He is a stuck-up, pompous rich kid, like all the rest," she spat as a reply before sinking back into her seat. "But he also doesn't like to take no for an answer." "What?" His eyes actually shifted from the road slightly, and for the first time since meeting him, she heard anger tinge his voice. "You've been out with him before?" Winter gave him a small nod. "Did he do any?" "No," Winter interrupted him quickly. "He wouldn't dare. But doesn't mean he didn't try and that his gentlemanly facade didn't fade the moment I pushed him away." "Cut!" Roman swore, his eyes returning to the road. "And your dad is still doing this after that?" "Like I said, he doesn't care," Winter replied, hating that the admission still hurt her a little. "The only thing he cares about is that stupid merger with Marigold Innovations." "Well, fuck him," Roman said bitterly as the light finally turned green, and he once again started to drive. "Just don't go." "It's not that simple," Winter replied with a saddened sigh. "When father is angry, he's very difficult to deal with. Me skipping college will annoy him, but he will just say I'm wasting my money, but if I skip the ball—" Cutting herself off as she didn't want to say aloud that her father might take it out on her siblings, or even her mother, Winter just shook her head and looked down at her lap. "Sorry," Roman sighed after a couple of minutes, turning left into a small residential area with multiple apartment buildings. "Keep forgetting that it's more difficult for you than that." "It's fine," she said quietly, wanting to move on from the conversation. "So where are we?" "My house." "What?" "Well, it's an apartment," Roman elaborated, clearly ignoring the true meaning of her surprise, as he drove into a nearby parking lot and pulled into an empty spot. "But where I live regardless." "And what are we doing at your home?" she asked, eyeing him suspiciously as he turned off the engine. "Not that." Roman chuckled and pushed his door open and pausing to look at her. "Just gonna hang out for a bit, or we could go downtown to a restaurant or something, but I'm broken, well, kinda barred from a lot of places." "Do I even want to know why?" "Probably not." He laughed while stepping out of the car and leaning down to look at her. "You coming?" Taking another second to look at the boy, she rolled her eyes and rolled up the window before pushed her own door open. Stepping out of the car, Winter took a quick look around the area. While most of it was tall apartment buildings, there were a few derelict houses, their windows smashing in with plywood blocking the doors. The slight smell of garbage and rotten fruit hung in the air and caused her nose to wrinkle slightly. "Sorry, the market was yesterday so kinda stinks at the minute," Roman said and locked the car up. "It's fine," she replied, following the boy towards a large gray tower apartment. "My grandfather grew up in a place like this in Mansell during the war. I visited it a few times before he passed." "Well then," he laughed as they approached the door and walked through into the entryway, the white-tiled walls almost indiscernible underneath the sheer amount of graffiti. "Glad to know me being poor doesn't bother you. Poor people are, most often than not, more hard-working than rich people," she replied and followed him up a narrow staircase. "Unless they do not even try, it is very rarely their fault that they must live in squalor. Squalor or not, it's a roof over our head." Roman shrugged as they reached the second floor and walked through the door. Trailing behind him slightly as they approached a door with a couple of leaflets sticking out from the letterbox, she watched him rip them from the hole and shove them into his jacket pocket before pulling a key from his jeans and put it in the lock. "Now don't get jealous when you see my home, all right?" He grinned and twisted the key. "I know you live in a mansion, but this small apartment is pretty great." Rolling her eyes playfully as he pushed the door open and stood aside to allow her to enter first, Winter took a step forward into Roman's home. Though she was met with another small entryway, at first glance it was rather nice. Unlike the hallway she had just stepped from, the walls were completely graffiti-free. Instead, they were a pleasant shade of orange with white streaks. A long, deep divot ran along the wall where a bowl was placed, the edges painted with very messy pictures of ice cream, clearly the work of a child. Smiling to herself, she began to turn back to Roman, but just as she was about to spin, a young, barefooted child with light, brown hair jumped into the hallway with her hand up like claws and almost made her scream. Stumbling backwards a little at the surprise and feeling Roman's hands catch her, she quickly made about straightening herself and looked to see the girl now staring at her, just as confused as Winter was herself. She also noticed another thing that took her by surprise, and that was that the girl had two different eye colors, her left being a dark brown and her right being a light pink. "Totally forgot to warn you about that," Roman chuckled behind her. "Liar," she breathed at him as her heart calmed its pace from the fright. "Is Dad in the kitchen, small scoop?" he said to the little girl, the humor of the situation still clear in his tone. In response, the girl gave a shake of her head and pointed towards the door behind them. "He went out?" he asked, letting out an annoyed sigh as he received a nod from the girl. "How long ago?" While Winter had noticed the interaction had been a little weird since the beginning, it was the girl's response to Roman's final question that caused her the most confusion. Instead of saying the answer, like most children would have, the girl looked up and thought for a moment, and then held out her hands to hold up 7 fingers, 2 of which she hesitantly put halfway down as if she thought it was wrong. "Damn it, I told him I wouldn't be long," the boy said, sigh a resigned groan, and threw his keys into the painted dish. "Winter, this is my niece Neo Torchu," cut off by the sudden rapid shaking of the little girl's head. Letting out a small chuckle, he held up his hand to signal her to stop. "Sorry, Neapolitan. Neo, this is Winter." Watching a wide smile take over the girl's face as Roman corrected himself, Winter was taken aback a little as the girl held her hand out. It was such an odd gesture to see a child her age do, but she happily leaned down and shook it nonetheless. "It's nice to meet you, Neo." Receiving a short nod from the girl that she took as her returning the sentiment, she let go and felt Roman walk up beside her. "I'm guessing you were just watching cartoons?" he asked the girl, who once again gave him a small nod. "All right, well, me and Winter are gonna hang out in my room. If you need a drink, then come and ask. I can't have you flooding the kitchen floor with juice again." With a small wave to them both, Neo ran back into the front room, and the sound of the television floated out through the ajar door. Smiling slightly at the little girl, Winter turned to Roman with a raised eyebrow. "Neapolitan? She's hooked on ice cream at the minute." He laughed and started to walk into the apartment a little before stopping at a door with a large pumpkin drawn on it in black marker. "She's insisted we call her that for the past month." "Cute," Winter chuckled as Roman reached up and ran his hand along the top of the door frame. "You said she's 5, right?" Roman hadn't talked about Neo too much in the time she had known him, but she did know a couple of things. She was his older brother's kid, though what happened to him she had no idea, and that she was frequently ill and kept home from school. Every other time she asked about the boy's family, he would simply shrug and say they were fine. "Yup," he replied, finding what he was looking for and pulling a key down. Slipping it into the door, he quickly pushed it open and allowed her to enter. "She's rather quiet?" she asked cautiously, looking around the room that was much cleaner than she had expected. "Yeah," Roman sighed and entered the room, leaving the door open behind him. "She's been mute for the last year and a half. Kind of frustrating as it makes it harder to know when she isn't feeling well." "Mute?" Winter asked in surprise, having thought that the girl was just rather quiet. "She never speaks?" "Sometimes a word will slip out if she's feeling really bad or really happy," the boy answered as he collapsed on his bed. Not seeing anywhere else to sit in the room, Winter simply stood in place. "She understands everything and can speak fine for the most part. Doctors say that she just doesn't want to for some reason. Probably my brother's doing." "What happened with him?" She paused as Roman swung himself up into a sitting position and rummaged around a small desk to pull out a control for the television in the corner. "I don't know." He shrugged and tapped the bed to show she could sit down. Hesitantly, she sat on the edge of the bed. "We went to his apartment one day and saw all his clothes gone. Figured he just took Neo and left. Turns he didn't even bother with her. We found her 2 days later bundled up in some clothes in her closet." "That's awful," Winter replied, unable to keep the appalled tone from her voice. "That's my brother for you," he said dismissively and sat back against the wall. "But she's been like that ever since. I'm pretty sure it doesn't help that my dad keeps leaving her alone as well, even though he knew I was gonna be back before he needed to leave for work. Anyway, enough about that, you can relax, you know." "I know," Winter replied, despite the fact that she was still barely sitting on the bed. Telling herself to sit back at least a little, she tried to move but was held back by the fact that if she did, then she would be right next to Roman, and on his bed no less. "Winter," Roman said softly, sitting forward a little and placing a hand on the bed just behind her. "I promise I'm not trying for anything here. The door's open, Neil can come in whenever. I just want you to relax for a bit, but if you'll feel more comfortable in the front room, or even going somewhere else, then we can." "No," Winter replied quickly, and turned around to look at him properly. "I know you're not, and I'm fine here, I just—" Shaking her head as she cut herself off, she let out a small sigh of frustration, and before her body could stop her, she pushed herself backwards. "See, I'm fine." "I'm you say so," he replied, looking at her carefully before sitting back against the wall himself. Holding up the remote, he turned the small television on and quickly turned it to an old movies channel. A silent, black and white film pushed its way through the slight static. As she watched a man with a very small mustache, heavy eyeliner, and a bowler hat being chased by the police, Roman's slight chuckle sounding next to her whenever something slapstick happened, she found it rather easy to relax. After a couple of minutes, she even let herself fall in a little closer to the boy, her head falling sideways onto his shoulder to enjoy his scent. It was only as the film ended that she realized she had felt something she hadn't in a while, something that she hadn't noticed creep up on her, as they watched them film silently. Sat there, her head on Roman's shoulder and her fingers lightly touching his, she finally felt at ease for once. Ignoring the pain as her knuckles rapped roughly on the door to where Roman lived, Winter waited impatiently for the door to be answered. She had no idea how he could be so stupid, how he could ever think that was the way things should be done. Thankfully, however, she didn't have to wait long for her answer, as seconds later the door opened and an older man she recognized as Roman's father stood in the doorway. "I'll go get him," the man said in a tired voice the moment he saw her. Before she could even thank him, he disappeared from the door and shouted for his son. Crossing her arms as she waited, she heard Roman and the older man talk a little before the door opened fully to reveal her smiling friend. "To what do I owe? What on earth were you thinking?" The smile immediately dropped from his face, and he gave her an exasperated sigh. "Were you even thinking? I don't can. Don't you dare lie to me, Roman." Winter cut him off again, the false innocence in his voice only annoying her further. "Did you really think he wouldn't mention the group of people that cornered him and warned him not to touch me? Threatening Henry like that has to be the stupidest thing I have ever seen you do." "Well, what would you have me do?" he fired back, all the feigned innocence gone from his voice. "Let him try and get all handsy with you again." "It was a public ball, Roman," she argued back angrily. "I may not have liked going with him, but even if he wanted to, he couldn't. I was just trying to ensure that was the case," Roman shot back, a little anger tinging his own voice. "I don't need to be protected." "Really?" he asked, stepping outside and closing the door slightly behind him. "Because it's very clear him, and people like him, have had a lasting impact on you." "And what does that mean?" she fumed angrily. "Do you think threatening him will get rid of the fact I hate being touched and make me sleep with you quicker?" The moment she said it, she regretted it. Roman had never pushed for that, and she knew it, but it didn't stop those fears, and in her anger, she had accidentally used them against him. To make it worse, the dangerous tone of voice she had only ever heard once before was clear as day when he replied, "If that is what you think I'm after, then you clearly don't know me. Raalm." Before she could finish her sentence, the boy had already disappeared into the apartment and slammed the door closed. A painful silence followed, and it was only then that Winter realized that, in the heat of the argument, tears had begun to gently spill down her cheeks. Again she had ruined things. Her anger, her trust issues, had hurt the only person who seemed to actually care about her. So swiping at the tears to clear them from her face, she turned on her heel and made her way back to the car. Pulling open the door of the salon, Winter watched the small child she was with jump happily down the steps first before following, the girl's freshly colored hair bouncing as she did. The moment she reached the pavement, she took off at a sprint towards the orange-haired boy sitting on the bench and stopped in front of him to excitedly point to her hair. Quickly catching up, Winter gave Roman a smile as she drew near. The mere fact that she was still able to do such a thing after their argument almost 3 weeks ago, making her smile just that little bit wider. The first few days had been rough after their fight. She cried more than she was even willing to admit to herself, and had once again felt the misery of being alone when the boy had not shown up at Beacon for just over a week. But thankfully, just as she was beginning to contemplate whether going to his apartment to make amends was a good idea, she walked out of her class to see him waiting for her. If the feeling so long ago of seeing him again after his 2 weeks' absence had been happiness, then the feeling of seeing him there after their fight surely had to have been elation. The conversation had been difficult at first, the awkwardness and stubbornness of them both making it tough for either to talk, but eventually they had settled it, and Winter had explained she had been worried that Henry could contact the police. While it still took some adjusting afterwards, they had eventually fallen back into their old relationship, though she still had no idea what that relationship was. "It looks great, small scoop." Roman grinned at that girl and ruffled the pink side of her hair that hung over her brown eye, causing the girl to shake her head as she stepped backwards out of his reach and towards Winter. "You gotta thank Winter for getting it done for you." With a wide smile, the girl wrapped her arms around the top of her legs for a couple of seconds before letting go and running off towards a nearby store window to look at herself in the reflection. "Thanks for this," the boy said once the girl was out of earshot, and Winter turned to see him standing up. "It's fine," she smiled back at him. "Though it won't last long. She's too young to have it dyed properly, so it's just a little color that will wash out in a week or two. That's more than I could give her anyway." He smiled and took a step towards her. Despite the traffic, both vehicular and pedestrian, she didn't move away from him. Instead, she let him sidle up to her, as they both turned to face the girl, who was still happily twisting locks of pink hair between her fingers. "You sure you do?" "I already said it's my treat," Winter interjected firmly, and began to walk towards the girl with Roman at her side. "Think of it as my way of making up for upsetting her." "You weren't the only one shouting," he shrugged dismissively, tapping Neil on the shoulder as they passed her so that she followed them. "But at least that passed us now." "MHM," she hummed, and despite all the traffic, she moved a little closer to him so that their arms were brushing against each other, something that he certainly noticed. "Though maybe I could make it up to you with a haircut of your own? That fringe is terrible." "What?" he asked incredulously, and moved his hand up to give the hair that hung in front of his face a small flick. "This adds to my mystique. It makes you look like those kids who hang out by that vampire shop." Winter laughed in response, earning a hurt glare from the boy. "Did you just call Hot Topic a vampire shop? Of course you know the name of it," she teased with a raised eyebrow, laughing at the crinkle that ran across his brow. "Everyone knows the name of it, Snow Queen," he replied, the amusement in his voice fighting the shaking of his head. "And I will have you know, it's a pretty great shop." It was her turn to shake her head at that statement, as she had seen some of the ghastly t-shirts Roman owned from that shop, but even as she did, the smile did not leave her face. Furthermore, as they started to round a corner, she felt his hand bump against her own. As usual, the flinch occurred, though less so than before, and gripped by a desire that she was tired of suppressing, she raised her arm and hooked it around Roman's. "Whoa," he said, as she felt his arm seize up a little but not move away. "Isn't this a little PUBL?" "No," she interrupted shakily, not wanting to be talked out of finally doing what she wanted. "I don't care anymore." "Are you sure? What about your father?" "It is time he learned that this life is mine," she replied stubbornly, gritting her teeth and moving a little closer to him. "Not his." For a couple of moments longer, she felt his hesitation, but as they came to a stop at a traffic light, she finally felt his arm relax and let out a small sigh. She doubted it had gone unnoticed, that there would not be some reporter around one of the corners that would snap their picture, but she didn't care. She was done with her father, done being his puppet, and losing everything because she was angry at him. She wanted freedom and happiness, and while the boy was certainly a little rough around the edges, Roman gave her that. Winter could see the reporters out of the corner of her eye, the plain white van far less suspicious than they thought it was, and she knew that they would likely be snapping as many pictures of her and Roman as they could, though while she didn't care, the fact that nothing had been reported yet did make her a little anxious. It had been over a week since she had noticed the first reporter snap a picture of them together, something that occurred a little more than a day after she had decided she didn't care anymore, and she had even been asked about him by one or two who were not content with simply getting the pictures. Normally, even her haircut would reach the magazines within hours, but there had been nothing. No headlines, no articles, no pictures published, and Winter knew what was likely causing the hold-up. Her father. While they had not spoken in over a week, the man was clearly informed as her internship at the STC had been swiftly ended. Not that the extra free time bothered her at all, but he had been making himself exceedingly scarce over the past few days. When she did see him, he refused to acknowledge her with anything other than sneers and snide remarks that were clearly made at her expense. However, she wasn't stupid. She knew he was up to something, and that it would all come to a head soon. Unfortunately for Winter, though, as she walked out of the gate with her arm hooked through Roman's, rolling her eyes at another cheesy compliment, she saw it. A gleaming white car that sat in the car park. She knew it on sight. Unlike the one what drove her around that was pure white, this car had a snowflake imprinted on the door. There was only one car that the family owned was marked in such a way, so that everyone who saw it knew who sat inside, and the moment she stepped out from the gate, the back door opened and a small chill ran through her. Well, she sighed, both of them stopping in their tracks as Roman had clearly seen it too. I guess it's finally time to have this out. Do you want me to come with you? He asked, a smile on his face that was clearly only for show. He might need a good punch in the face. Though the offer is appreciated, and he certainly deserves it, I would rather you not give him a reason to have you arrested, Winter said and turned to face him. Ignoring the fact that her father was likely watching her, and the small amount of hesitation as she leaned in to press her lips against his, she enjoyed the moment for what it was, as she knew future ones would be very hard to come by soon. Not holding it too long, she pulled away and gave him a smile. I will see you tomorrow? Sure, Neo's got the dentist a little before you finish class, so I'll probably bring her along with me. All right, Winter replied, giving him another small peck on the cheek before letting out a small sigh to herself as she started towards the car. Here it goes. As she approached the car, she took a deep breath, and steeling herself, she placed her hand on the door to pull it fully open. Sat inside, not even looking at her, was her father, his white suit standing out even in the darkness created by the tinted windows. Get in now, he said while looking out the window, his voice carrying its usual drawl, but with a threatening undertone. Letting out her breath, she reluctantly obeyed and slipped into the seat. Waving a quick goodbye to Roman, she shut the door, and the car took off before she could even buckle her seatbelt. The entire drive to the Schnee Manor had been silent, neither of them willing to be the first to address the other. The man did make sure to sneer at her every opportunity he got until they got to the house. Once they had arrived, he immediately shouldered his way out of the car and stormed into the house, muttering only one word. Office. So that was where she stood. In the cold, plain office that her father spent a majority of her time. Unlike most of the Schnee Manor, the floor and walls were a dark brown. Along each side were bookshelves, each one lined with more books than anyone could read on business and law, among many other things. In the center of the room was a couch and two chairs, a small glass table resting between them, that she knew were often used for meetings with shareholders and other business partners the man consorted with. At the end of the room was a long brown desk, the chair facing the door with a large picture of himself hanging on the wall. Hearing the door slam behind her, she turned to see her father stalking his way across the room with a foul look on his face as he moved to sit at his desk. Once seated, he quickly dug through one of his drawers, and after a couple of seconds searching, he pulled out a thin file and slammed it on the table. I would ask for your excuse on these, he said, his dull voice low and menacing. But after that display, I hardly feel it would be necessary. Glancing down at the photographs that had spilled from the file as he placed it, she saw multiple different shots of her and Roman. Is it against the rules for me to have friends now? She asked sardonically, crossing her arms stubbornly. You call this friends? He sneered, picking up an image of her and Roman kissing. If that is what you do with all your friends, then clearly I have raised you wrong. Or maybe it just runs in the family. Jock's eyes narrowed menacingly at her, but she didn't care. Arguments were more frequent than conversations between the both of them, and Winter had grown accustomed to the looks her father used in an attempt to intimidate her. Besides, I fail to see how mine and Roman's relationship has anything to do with you. You think it has nothing to do with me? Jock snarled and pulled a piece of paper from the file. You think your friendship with this boy does not affect me when he has 3 arrests under his belt already? You think it does not affect how our business partners view our family? How our shareholders view our competency? Like it or not, child, every action you take that becomes public knowledge has an effect on our family, and this deviant will do nothing but affect the public image of this company and cast doubt on your claim to it." Winter rolled her eyes in annoyance at the man's words and crossed her arms. "How many times do I have to tell you that I do not want to run the company?" she countered heatedly. "And if we are talking of crimes committed, how many times would you have been arrested if you didn't have half a veil in your pocket? The only person who embarrasses this family is you, father." "I have committed no crimes," the man replied angrily, his mustache quivering as his voice rose. "But I have grown weary of this attitude. Thankfully, however, I now have a good idea of where it is coming from, and if this is the influence such a boy has on you, then I do not think it wise that I continue to allow your friendship. My issues with you go much further back than me meeting Roman, and you know it." Winter snarled back, her anger growing further, as she finally tired of the man's false ignorance of everything he had done to her. "As for me not seeing him any more, that is something you have no control over." "Is that what you believe?" "Yes," she argued back, taking a step towards the desk and pointedly picking up one of the candidates to put in her pocket. "This is my life, father, and I am through with letting you control it. I will not be taking the company, I will not be doing anything you expect of me, and I will most certainly not stop seeing Roman because you say so. If that is a problem with you, then strip me of my title and all your so-called support. I do not care. Grandfather at least saw what you were towards the end and made sure that I alone have sole access to the money he left for me." With one last glare into her father's cold, blue eyes, Winter ripped another picture from the deck and turned around, striding quickly towards the door. Once she reached it, she twisted the door handle and ripped it open. However, before she could walk out and slam it behind her, she heard her father's malicious drawl once more. "I will not let you throw your life away and embarrass this family, child," he said, the voice sending a chill down her spine despite her anger. "See this reprobate again, and you will leave me no choice but to take action." Stopping for only a second, she felt a sneer pull at her face, and stepped outside of the office, and slammed the door shut behind her. She was under no disillusion that what she had just done wouldn't have consequences, but whatever they were she would face them. All that mattered was that she had finally stood up to him. As the sounds of laughter floated from the television, and the girl at her side, Winter felt a small smile pull at her lips. It had been almost 2 weeks since the argument with her father, and in that time, she had done exactly as she told her father she would. When she was not at college or spending time with her siblings, she had taken to spending as much time with Roman as she could. Not just because she knew it would annoy her father all the more, but because she was finally able to freely admit to herself that she really did enjoy his company. So to be sat in Roman's living room on a Saturday morning, her head resting on the boy's shoulder as Neo sat on his lap carving a candle with a toothpick and watching cartoons, Winter found herself happy, even if she did know that the future would soon get rather rough. "What's got you smiling?" Roman asked gently, grinning at her as brushed away a piece of wax from Neo's hair, which had almost completely returned to its usual light brown. "Finally realized how devilishly handsome I am." "You wish," she chuckled and shook her head. "I was actually just admiring how good Neo's carving is." Technically the last statement was a lie, as her best guess at what the girl was carving into the pink wax was something ice cream related, and even that was merely a guess based on how much the girl loved the food. Though Neo still gladly accepted the compliment by giving her a wide smile. "Wow!" Roman exclaimed in surprise. "Did you just compliment someone?" "I compliment people quite frequently," Winter replied smugly with a roll of her eyes. While she was now willing to admit she liked the boy, she was hardly going to make things easy for him and let his head get even bigger. "Though I do have to like them to compliment them." "Really?" He chuckled and went to move his arm from around her shoulders and disturbing how comfortable she was. "Then this may be giving me the wrong impression." Quickly reaching up, she grabbed his wrist and returned it to her shoulders before relaxing into him a little more. Since they had been in the open and spent more time together, she had slowly been trying to get past her reservations about being touched, and while there was still some level of discomfort when initiated, she found that it faded much quicker than it used to. "Maybe you're just warm. It's hotter than an oven in here. I get cold easily." Winter shrugged, despite Roman being right about how hot it was without any air conditioning. "If you say so," he chuckled, giving up and turning back to watch the girl, who was still happily scratching patterns into her candle. "So has your dad done anything yet?" "No," Winter replied easily as Roman had asked the same question every time they had been together that week. "Are you nervous?" "Nah," Roman said dismissively and brushed away a small clump of wax that had gathered in one of Neo's older etchings. What's he gonna do? Get me arrested for kissing his daughter? Would probably be the most worthwhile thing I've spent time in a cell for. That's not funny. She scolded him with a raised eyebrow. You already have a record he could use to do it. My record is shoplifting and petty theft. Roman shrugged as Neo handed him the toothpick, and he started to scratch what looked to be a misshapen pumpkin next to what looked to be an ice cream cone. Caught off guard by that last one, she raised her head and turned to look at him properly. That last one? Relax, it's nothing, the boy said in a reassuring voice. We sold our old TV to some girl who used to live around here, and she gave us counterfeit lien. So when she refused to return it, I took it. Plus, she was a bitch who treated everyone like shit anyway. That doesn't make it okay. Things work a little differently around. Roman was cut off by a loud bang from the hallway, and though he reacted quickly by picking Neo up from his lap as he stood and dumped her behind the couch, he visibly relaxed after a loud swear issued from the hallway that Winter recognized as the boy's father. For a couple of moments, she had actually been a little frightened by the reaction, but knowing the stories her grandfather had told her about where he had grown up, it didn't surprise her. What did surprise her, however, was that Roman's father quickly came into the room with a furious expression on his face. She had met the man a couple of times in the last month since she had first visited Roman's house, and while he wasn't the most affectionate man, he certainly didn't seem bad. Tired? Certainly. A little irritable? Sure. But whenever she visited and he was home, he was usually either playing with Neo or watching television. Dad? Roman said, clearly as confused as she was. What's up? Read it for yourself, he growled, holding up a brown envelope that he quickly slammed down on the table. I need a drink. As the man stormed off towards the kitchen, Roman reached out and picked up the letter, only for his brow to quickly start to crease. While the boy read what she assumed was bad news, Winter turned around and looked behind the chair expecting to see Neo, but was met with nothing but a confusing empty space. Neo? She called carefully and watched in surprise as the girl's brown and faded pink hair began to emerge from a small flap in the back of the couch. Once her head was fully exposed, the girl looked out at her with curious eyes. It's okay. It was just your grandfather. Seeing a little relief pass through the Neo's mismatched eyes, Winter held her hand out and pulled the girl back up over the couch to sit down, and by the time she had finished, she heard Roman let out a cuss word that actually made Winter want to cover her own ears. What is it? Our building's been sold, he said with barely suppressed anger. And the new owners are tearing it down. We have 2 weeks to leave. What? Snatching the letter from his hand, as she knew the new owner would be required to give more notice than that, she quickly read through and felt her heart drop as her eyes latched onto the name of the company that had bought it, Bronzewing Motors. She knew the name, and not because they were the largest manufacturers of luxury vehicles in all of Atlas, the very same who had provided her family with the cars that drove them around, but because she knew for a fact they were a subsidiary of the STC. You're tearing down his house. The words had flown from her mouth before the sound of the office door slamming shut could stop reverberating around the cold, square room. The entire drive back to the house, after reassuring Roman that she would sort it, had felt like the longest in her life as anger and impatience had coursed through her veins. So to arrive and see him completely unfazed by her accusation only annoyed her even more. What house? He said in his normal monotone drawl, not bothering to even look up from the papers on his desk. Roman! Winter snarled and slammed the eviction notice on the desk. Looking up from his papers this time, he reached out and picked up the letter and gave it a once-over. After a couple of seconds, he gave a brief, non-committal shrug and put it back down. Mr. Bronzewing has been looking to expand into Vale for some time now, he said, returning to the papers he had been working on prior. We simply helped him find a suitable location for his new factory. Suitable location? Winter replied incredulously, snatching the pen from her father's hand and tossing it aside. You expect me to believe this is mere coincidence? I could not care less what you believe. You cannot do this, father, she fired back, changing course as she knew her father's statement was true. This kind of action requires council permission, revolving of tenancy agreements. These things take longer than 2 weeks. It is quite funny you mention tenancy agreements, Shock replied, leaning back in his chair with an amused look on his face. They have none. None of the residents in the area do. Though I believe that is hardly my fault and more an issue with how the previous owner handled things. As for the council issue, well, there wasn't any. As it turns out, that area has been a problem for a while despite numerous attempts to clean it up. Crime, drugs, you name it, and that place is home to it. So when I pitched them an idea that would resolve that and create plenty of jobs for the poor surrounding areas, they were all for it. In fact, they were rather eager to get started as soon as we could. And I am sure you didn't sign any of them a hefty check. Winter replied sarcastically, appalled by how flippant her was about the whole situation. You would unhouse hundreds of people because you are not getting your way. People who have nowhere else to go. The STC is a business, daughter, he said callously, and pressed the tips of his fingers together. If I were to try to please everyone, then nothing would ever get done. But you never know, maybe your friend could return there in a couple of years. I am sure there will be an open space on the workforce. After all, creating jobs are what we are trying to hear. Do bastard. Winter spat angrily at him, slamming her hand on the table and ignoring the pain that shot through her wrist. You vile, manipulative bastard. Watch your two. No. Winter sneered, cutting the man off as he began to stand up. Do you think that treading in these people will remove who you were? That it will change where you come from? Because you know it won't. You may act like you are better than them now, but you will always be the son of a coked-up poor th. Winter heard the crack that echoed around the room before she felt the sting, but as she fell over from the force of the hit, the burning on her cheek quickly began to grow hotter. Feeling tears sting her eyes from the pain that coursed through her body, she looked up at her father through blurred vision to see her father adjusting his tie, not an ounce of remorse on his face at all. I have allowed this attitude to continue too long, he said, the bored tone of his voice tinged with disappointment. Clearly that speaks to my failure as a parent, but that changes now. It is time you learned that there are consequences to your actions, that I am your father, and that you will do as you are told. Standing up slowly and raising a hand to her cheek, Winter stared her father in the eyes, and felt her resolve bolstered by the fact that she no longer cared about the uncaring gaze they held. Feeling a sneer pull at her face, she straightened up and prepared for what she knew would come. Fick Dyke. As she knew it would, another loud crack sounded through the room, and though she remained standing while her face whipped to the side, the struck cheek began to burn just as the other did. Yet again, there was nothing in the man's eyes but a bored expression. What a disappointment you have turned out to be, he said coldly, the sentiment enforced by how clear it was in his voice. After everything I have given you, everything I offered you, this is how you repay me? No matter, it doesn't do to waste time on a lost cause. Since you clearly do not want it, I will revoke your claim to the company, and you will be free to gallivant around with whoever you choose, though when you see how difficult your life is without my support, I expect you will come crawling back. The threat in her father's voice was clear as day. She could go, but she would never be free. He would make her life a hell, Romans 2, until she came back. In the meantime, however, a spine-chilling coldness captures his voice as he slowly walked his way back around the desk and took a seat. Weiss will take your place as heiress to the Schnee Company. Hopefully, she will not disappoint me as you have. For the second time that day, her heart dropped and her stomach churned. The thought of her sister one day receiving the same treatment if she ever let their father down, or even worse, turning into the man before her made her feel sick. But if she stayed, then he would win. He would get everything he wanted, and she would be left with nothing again. How did she choose? Her life or her sister? Was there a more cruel choice the world could force upon her? Now that you have your freedom and your money, he said, and pulled out another pin from his drawer, I think it is time you left my house. What did she do? Roman or Weiss? Freedom or her sister? Screaming for both filled her head, and she felt a tear spill down her cheek, the warmth of it soothing the line that it drew on her burning cheek. She was stuck. She had no idea what she would do. She wanted freedom more than anything, away from her father and everything he represented, but she loved Weiss with everything she had, and had sworn to never let her suffer. Feeling hopelessness begin to set in, she wrapped her arms around her chest and let the tears flow freely, and as she did, a single question filled her thoughts. What do I do? I'm sorry. Despite having ran countless scenarios through her head over the past couple of days, none of them had prepared her for just how much it hurt her to say those words. But then again, none of what she had planned over the last day had hurt as much as the goodbye they both knew they were sharing on a nondescript bench in downtown Vale. "I know," Roman replied, his voice low and filled with sadness that he was clearly trying to cover up. I can't leave her," she choked out, feeling the need to make sure the boy understood why she had made the choice she had. "I get it, Winter," Roman said softly, his hand coming out to take hers lightly. "Your sister comes first. This isn't your fault." "But it is," Winter sighed, and let her head drop to stare at her lap. "I was stupid. I got arrogant and didn't think things through. And worst of all, I underestimated Father despite knowing what he was capable, and you're going to lose your home because of it." "Still not your fault," he said firmly, and sat back on the bench. "You wanted away from him, but he put you between a rock and a hard place. Everything that happened is because of him. Maybe I should never have confronted you that day." A long silence filled the space between them, a silence that made Winter fear that Roman was inwardly agreeing with that sentence. So turning to look, she was surprised to find him smiling to himself. "Nah, I'm glad you did," he chuckled and looked up at the sky fondly. "I got to know you, that's worth it to me." "I'm pretty sure meeting me is not worth your house," Winter countered, not believing that Roman was as okay with it he was acting. "You would be surprised," he shrugged in his usual carefree dismissive tone. "Plus, we were constantly behind on rent, so it was bound to happen sooner or later." "Roman, you don." "Stop, Winter," he interrupted, the smile fading from his face slightly. "What's done is done. You can't stop him, I certainly can't, we just have to roll with the punches. My family is pretty used to it, honestly." "I would still prefer you hate me," Winter said honestly. Though the idea of Roman hating her made her feel sick, she still felt like she deserved it. "Never gonna happen, Snow Queen," he replied gently, and gave her hand a squeeze. Letting out a sigh at the boy's stubbornness, she felt him move a little closer, and let her head drop to his shoulder for what she knew would be the last time. She didn't care that people gave them glances as they passed. The only thing she wanted was to remember the light scent of vanilla and orange that constantly surrounded him. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked cautiously, trying to stretch out their final conversation a little longer so that she could enjoy the moment as long as she could. "About your living situation." "We're gonna stay at a friend's for a while," he said after a second and put an arm around her shoulders. "At least until Dad find a new place." "Do you need any help?" Winter offered, feeling like it was the very least he was owed. "I can give you some ammo." "No." The voice in which he cut her off was firmer than any she had heard him use before, as if the very idea was impossible for him to even consider. "I have PLE. I don't care if you have enough." He cut her off again, his head resting against hers. "I don't want you giving me money to be the last memory we have of each other." While she knew the boy was right about it being their last memory together, to hear Roman say it felt like she had been punched in the stomach, and as that thought invaded her mind more and more, she felt a wetness running down her cheek. "Just promise me one thing, okay?" he continued, clearly not caring that her mascara-blackened tears were running onto his favorite white jacket. "I know your sister means a lot to you, but if it ever gets too bad, if you can't cope with it anymore, and you feel like there is nothing left, get out. Be selfish and put yourself first like you tried to do this time, and get away from him. Please promise me that." Unable to say a word due to the lump in her throat, Winter gave a short nod of her head. It was all she could manage, but thankfully it was enough. "Good." Feeling his arm give her a small squeeze, she let out a small sob as she remembered that it was likely going to be the last time she felt such a thing from him. As the minutes passed, she felt the tears flow steadily, and when she felt his arm slacken slightly, she couldn't stop another sob that pushed its way from her throat. "I wish I had more time to stay here with you," he sighed, the sadness in his voice clear this time. "But I need to pick up Neo from kindergarten." Despite the sadness that overtook her, she understood and slowly pulled away to look him in his beautiful green eyes, one covered by the orange fringe as always. There was a sadness there too, a sadness that told her he too didn't want to leave, but they both knew he would have to eventually, so giving him a small nod that splashed the tears that had collected on her chin down his shirt. Standing with him, as he slung a small backpack over his shoulder, they turned to face each other, and she felt him pull her into a one-armed hug. I'm going to miss you, she sobbed out in a quiet croak. Me too, Snow Queen, he replied, his voice cracking slightly as he pulled away. But maybe you'll find me again one day. Looking up into his green eyes once again, she knew it was her last chance to show how much he meant to her. So despite her tear-streaked face and her quivering lips, she ran her fingers through his fringe and pressed her lips against his. The instant she did, she regretted it, not because of the usual instinctual reason, but because it was nowhere to be seen. As their lips met, there was no awkwardness, no reservations that held her back. Everything she normally felt when simply being touched was gone, and in that moment she knew why, but the realization hurt her all the more. She loved him. So as he pulled away and looked down at her from the very slight height advantage he had over her, she dreaded the next words that were going to leave his mouth. Goodbye, Winter. Composing herself just enough as her whole body began begging to break down, she gave a loud sniff and tried her best to give him a smile in return. Gee, goodbye, Roman. If the words had hurt, the feel of his hand slipping from hers had to be the worst agony imaginable. She was certain of it. But just as there was always more cruelty her father was capable of, there were worse feelings than seeing him walk away, a point that was proven as he walked around the corner with one last wave to never been seen by her again. Never again would she hear his voice. Never again would she see his smile. Never again would his crack jokes that made her eyes roll. As all of that realization finally crashed down on her, she found she no longer had the strength to stand and collapsed to the bench they had both been sat at moments ago, not caring who of the people passing by saw her cry. It had been a month since she had watched Roman walk away, a month of loneliness like she had never known before. A month of crying and pain, of putting up with her father and trying to be strong for her sister. But with every day that passed, with every day she tried to tell herself she was doing better, Winter knew she wasn't. Every day at college was miserable. She could see the glances while sat alone eating lunch and hear the whispered rumors that were carried on the wind. And while she had never cared for them before, each one reminded her that the happiest thing she had in some time was gone, and he was never coming back. Worse was that nothing at home had changed. Since she had chosen to stay, her father had chosen not to remove her title, therefore keeping her as the heiress to the company. The only person who could have helped her was falling deeper and deeper into alcohol. Weiss and Whitley were thankfully still unaware that anything had happened, though Whitley had walked in on her crying to herself a few times, but she had always managed to compose herself and told him to go play elsewhere. However, she knew those days couldn't last, especially not since it was Weiss' birthday and she had promised to take her shopping. So reluctantly, she had pulled herself together and dressed herself to leave the house. She had made sure to leave before her father had woken, to avoid the usual sneers and snide remarks he had taken to giving her, and had spent the last 5 hours in various clothing and music store with her sister. However, at some point in the day, they had passed by a mirror, and she had seen that her hair had grown a little longer than she usually liked it without her monthly trim. So decided that would be a good first step, she had pulled Weiss into the same barber shop she had visited with Neil and Roman and dropped herself into a chair. And that was where she had been sitting for the last couple of minutes, looking at the dark rings that circled her eyes, watching as the man delicately tended to her hair, careful not to make a single mistake. But as she watched the man slowly move his scissors to the front of her hair, she felt her stomach churn as a word ripped itself from her throat. Stop! Immediately he complied, the sharp metal hovering just over her fringe. Usually she would have him trim that too, as she hated having hair in her eyes, but as she had watched the scissors move towards the hair, the idea of cutting it off just didn't sit right with her. Leave it! Are you sure, Miss Schnee? Taking another look in the mirror at the white hair that just touched her eyebrows, she felt a lump in her throat begin to form as her nose wrinkled with a slight anger that began to gently pump through her. If her father was going to act as he did, then she would make damn sure that he didn't forget that she hated his guts. She would make sure that he never forgot what she truly thought of him and his company, and while she wasn't capable of much, this small act of defiance was more than enough for now. So steeling herself as she settled on that decision, she gave that man a short nod and answered firmly. Yes. Yang Xiaolong. Present day. Not a word had been said as Winter told her story, but the longer she talked, the tighter she had felt Weiss' hand grip hers. She didn't blame her for being angry. Yang had only just met the woman that sat before her, but even she felt bad for what had been done to her. To have a parent rip away something so cruelly was inconceivable to her. Though as angry she was at the man she had never met, it was nothing compared to what she had watched grow on her girlfriend's face. So she was not surprised that once Winter finally stopped talking, Wise stood from the couch and stormed out of the room, slamming the door hard enough behind her that Winter's abandoned cup shook where it stood on the table.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.